If you master this skill, you won't worry about AI taking your job, tech layoffs, or whatever will happen with the market. The skill I'm talking about, it's live coding. And despite what some people here on YouTube want you to believe, you don't need to waste months on LeetCode in order for you to get good at it. You only need to apply the principles that Bogdan and I are going to show you in this video. If you look at how technical interviews are being done these days, you will see what we call a take-home tasks inflation. What do we mean by that, Bogdan?
So what happened when everybody started using GPT and Cursor with all the new models is that all of a sudden, not only people can write a lot of code, but also a lot of people that were backend developers now can build a front-end take-home task, or at least can submit something that's decent. Or people that are front-end, they can submit an API task. And what's been happening is that all of a sudden, when you send a take-home task out as a company, instead of having 3 people submitting, which should be the case back in the days because most people would say, oh, I don't have time for this. Now you have 20. And so all of a sudden, there's been an inflation, as you mentioned. Like people can do take-home task faster and better because of the AI tools, and also the competition double because all of a sudden everybody, like I know people that were Java devs that went for senior front-end engineer position because they coded the whole thing with AI.
I heard of people who just get the description of the take-home challenge or take-home task you're being sent and they feed that into Cursor, for example, and kind of, 80% of the job is done, right? At least that's what they believe, right?
And you had this take-home task where sometimes they would not only tell you what they need, like, hey, we want a data fetching with pagination and some feature, but they also tell you how to do it. We want you to use Redux and we want you to use React Query, for example. And so it's so easy, especially those ones, to feed them to GPT because you're really giving the detailed instructions of what to do.
The second reason why this skill is actually the skill to learn in 2025 as a software engineer is that take-home tasks are high effort and low value.
Exactly. And this is something we tell everybody that we work with. The take-home task, it's literally the brute force approach to interviewing. It requires a lot of upfront work from your side, and it's usually a very poor strategy. And so what people usually do is that because they are scared of other forms of interviewing, they feel like the take-home task is actually one of the safest way to get a job. Some of them maybe got a job doing a take-home task 3 years ago, but that's not the case anymore in 2025. If you're doing a take-home task, the company has all the power. You put a lot of work. I'm talking about 20 hours plus to do something decent. I know they all say it's going to take 2 hours. It never takes 2 hours. I have not seen a take-home task to take 2 hours. Yes, maybe it takes 2 hours to do it, but to do something that will actually get you the review or like the next interview, it usually takes around 20 hours. Like we're talking about deploying it, writing tests, adding a README. That's like, they usually require production ready code, even when they say, oh, it doesn't have to be production ready.
Yeah, and that's the funny part. You can get rejected on a whim. They'll just look at a certain line of code they don't like. They have 13 people who also did the take-home task, and you just get rejected after maybe you put like 7 days of work into that. It won't matter, right? So high effort, low value.
Yeah, you would be surprised how people get rejected over the most trivial thing and how little time the company actually spends reviewing it. Like you would spend 20 hours and a lot of people think, well, I spent 20 hours. They're going to look at my code and they're going to look at my components or whatever, everything I wrote. And the person, evaluating this will maybe spend like 1 minute. They open a bunch of files. They look at something. If they like it, they'll find a reason to invite you to the next stage. If not, they'll find anything. Things like, oh, but I feel like you over-engineered, or you should have done this differently. And then you're out.
Yeah, because this hiring manager or whoever is analyzing this has 1,000 things to do, and then it has to review during their week, 17 take-home tasks, right? So they will spend a few seconds on it. You spend weeks on them, right? This is the commitment. It's asymmetric. So there is one part that will always end up losing in these kind of relationships, which is usually the candidate. You will probably have to live code anyways. Even if you don't like live coding, you'll still have to do it.
Exactly. And what we've seen happening with a lot of people is they do the take-home task, they use AI, they write all this nice code, they get invited to the next stage, and the senior engineer looks at the code and says, can you extend this part of the code? And that's when they have to code live, right? And you're back to square one.
And that's when, also, if you used AI in your take-home task and you cannot explain what, ChatGPT or Cursor did over there, you're going to get yourself in trouble. And finally, the few developers who can actually live code will automatically stand out.
Exactly. So we see a lot of people thinking, well, with AI, I won't have to go through this pain, which is doing a live coding interview. I don't have to go through this painful experience and traumatic experience. And everybody's hiding behind, oh, can I just do a take-home task? Everybody applies to companies that offer a take-home task. And what you see is that if you actually know how to code and you can more or less just code your way out of a standard live coding problem, you'll see yourself in an abundance of companies that you can apply to. AI didn't make everybody smarter. It just actually made everybody more dependent on AI. And so the scenarios where you cannot use AI, those ones are actually underinvested. And there's a lot of space for great developers to stand out there.
One thing we don't mention here is also feedback. So the big advantage of a live coding interview versus a take-home task, it's the feedback loop. It's so much faster, right? You jump on an interview, you are there with the interviewer, you try to do your best, right? And you get your feedback within, maybe in the same day, maybe in the interview without you having to wait, right? In exchange, when you send a take-home task over, you might wait weeks, and you might not get any feedback because companies are very afraid to give candidates feedback because, some people behave badly. Some people might take you to court. I've seen some very well-intended engineering managers who tried to give feedback to candidates, and then some candidates would actually try to fight back, try to put the company in a bad spot, which is why companies are very careful with giving feedback. They don't want one of the emails to be leaked on social media, on LinkedIn, and then you get in bigger trouble. So if you want quick feedback on your skills, live coding is probably the way to go.
The thing is, if you do live coding interviews, you can probably do 10 of them in a week. Like you can at least do 2 to 3 a day. Whereas when you do a take home, that's usually the one thing you'll do that week because it takes so much focused time that your main energy will go into that. So would you rather play your hand, 10 times a week or one? Who do you think will be more successful? So it's a lot easier to get lucky if the numbers are on your side.
On to the next point. Now, if live coding is so amazing and is the skill that will make you AI proof in 2025 and beyond, then why do developers struggle with live coding in the first place? Because half of the stuff you're going to see on YouTube, it's about how to get better at, live coding and FANG interviews and LeetCode and all that stuff. So why is it still that developers struggle with it if it's so over-invested? Well, first of all, there is what we call the LeetCode disillusion. Bogdan, what is the LeetCode disillusion?
What usually happens when we fail a live coding interview is that people get into this mode, well, I'm just going to LeetCode for the next 6 months and I'm going to get good and I'm going to pass it. And then they go in, they start LeetCode and 6 months later, they eventually quit. Because, and this is from my personal experience, I've tried, I think I did LeetCode almost full time for 3 months and I got to a really decent level and I got so burned out with it that the moment I see that interface, I already get like anger attack. The way LeetCode is designed, it's a bit like the Squid Games. I don't know if you remember the series where there's 300 people and one of them will get $1 million and the other ones, the 299 will die. And for a fun reason, if you watch the series, people actually were trying to win the Squid Game. So you realize, the most likely outcome is that you're going to die. So the problems are so hard and sometimes they're so random. They're so far away from the stuff we actually face when we work that it's almost as a full-time job. So thinking that you'll go in and grind LeetCode, sure, you can get marginally better. And then they go to an interview and they get the problem that they didn't touch. And that's when the story ends. So I think LeetCode is one of the most inefficient ways to get good at live coding. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but we'll see that in a second.
Okay, now the second reason why developers struggle with live coding, it's over-reliance and dependency on the dev tooling. What do we mean by this, Bogdan?
This is one of the reasons why if you fail a live coding interview, don't blame yourself. Like that's the first thing is people blame themselves or they think they're not good. The reality is the way the interview is set up, it has nothing to do with your day-to-day coding. So how are you expecting to get good at it? In most of those interviews, they will give you like a code editor. Sometimes the code editor doesn't even has autocomplete. It doesn't have AI. And so if you're used to be able to Google, be able to check documentation, be able to have IntelliJ auto-completing your code and having things like Copilot, you take all that out and all of a sudden that's a whole new world. That's just coding from the top of your head. And that's a lot harder, or at least it looks a lot harder because you've never done it before like that. Because nobody really works like that. Like developers use developer tooling to get faster and better. Nobody just walks away writing code in the Word document. My IDE is not Microsoft Office.
The next reason, it's framework abstractions. And this is a big one, especially for JavaScript devs.
Exactly. So nowadays, you almost never use native APIs. Like you almost never have to write a for loop yourself because we usually use .map or .reduce. And it's the same with DOM APIs and JavaScript, you almost never have to create a promise object yourself. You usually receive one from the fetch function. And I could give you thousands of examples, but we are so used to rely on the framework we are using, and we take those things for granted. And so when they are not there, all of a sudden, we feel like we don't know what we're doing. Because again, it's not because it's hard, it's just because that's new territory.
And later in this video, we will show you how to deal with this dependency on framework abstractions. On to point number 4, past trauma. And this is something, Bogdan, you can talk about a lot, I guess.
Exactly. This probably should be number 1, but we know that everybody talks about this, so we really wanted to touch it last. One of the most common thing we see is that people, you go in, you have one live coding interview, and it goes so terribly wrong because of all these 3 reasons, right? You probably practice with LeetCode, and then you get something you didn't expect it. You were over relying on the tooling and on the frameworks or on AI, and all of a sudden, all of that is gone. And so people get this feeling of, I know nothing. Like the impostor syndrome just goes through the roof, and they're like, wow, okay, I'm done. I'll never do this again. This is not for me. I think this is also because there's a lot of elitistic thinking in tech. And when I've been on the both sides. I've been as an interviewer, and I also been interviewing people. And it was so easy, especially when you work for this unicorn or tech, big fan companies. It's so easy to look down on the other people, and being there, doing your best, failing and being looked down on. That's such an emotional experience and so traumatic, and it makes people feel so bad with themselves, and it amplifies whatever insecurity they had. And so the number one thing we see is that people just say, well, I'm not going to do any more live coding. They reject, we had people getting messaged by their dream company and inviting them over, and they would be like, no. Like, maybe, what do? I tell them in 3 months or 6 months, the opening is not there in 6 months. And so they get this panic attack because of past experience.
Yeah, and talking about the FANG industry and tech in general, I think there is this pressure to look smart, and there's all this smartness, and looking smart means, speaking in certain way, using certain jargon, adding a lot of abstraction. And I think a lot of people are holding back from actually asking questions and not being afraid to be curious. And this is overall the whole tech sector, and I think it's doing more damage than good. And the result of all this is that developers can code, but they cannot program. And it's time for us to really learn how to program, which brings us to point number 3, how to master live coding and not die trying. And the first thing you have to get right if you want to master live coding, it's you need to make fundamentals your second nature. Bogdan, what do we mean by that?
So here it's when you want to get rid of everything. You want to get rid of the framework. You want to get rid of even your IDE. And I challenge you to do this exercise just after this video. Right now, pause the video, open a block note, and try to write a program that just iterates over an array with a for loop and creates the sum, and do it in your notepad. And you'll see how different that is. Now, I'm not saying you're going to make, the note block or Microsoft document your programming tool, but I want you to go to that extreme, because that's when you get rid of everything and you realize code is just text, right? It will get interpreted by a compiler and then executed. And you'll start, everything all of a sudden will not look so hard. You'll be like, well, wait a second. If we start C at 0, how do I get back to React, JSX, the editor, AI, TypeScript, and all that? And so you really want to know how to move across the whole spectrum and understand that most of the times you operate here with abstractions, tooling. And so it will be hard to operate on the other extreme just because you're not used to it. And that's why you got to get rid of everything.
And Bogdan, I will add on this, because in this AI age where everybody is AI, we forget one simple thing. Code was invented by humans, and it's built in such a way, right? It's kind of the compromise, the bridge between machines, the way machines think, and they can only think in zeros and ones. They have transistors, they don't have neurons, and humans, right? And I remember Paul Allen, Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, when Bill Gates tell the story about Paul Allen. They had a big demo the next day, and he wrote the compiler by hand on a piece of paper in the airplane, and it all compiled perfectly. Right now, of course, you don't have to be, you don't have to reach that level, but that's what we're talking about. I mean, programming was built by humans, right? And you can use your brain actually, and you can learn these things, and you can use your brain first, your thinking first, before defaulting on pre-made things. Now, to make fundamentals second nature, you need to start thinking in first principles over abstractions.
So for example, every time you're iterating in your code, you're writing a map or reduce, always ask yourself as a small mental exercise, how would I write this with a for loop? Or how would I write this with a while loop? Or can I make this recursive? These 3 questions will tell you almost 99% of the things you need to know about that piece of code. If you can answer those three, I promise you can walk away alive with your dignity intact from any code interview, regardless of if you solve the specific problem they throw at you or not.
The second thing, it's understanding that complexity, it's only an aggregate of simplicity.
Exactly. And this is what we call death by 1,000 cuts. So a lot of people sometimes say, well, I'm slower or I couldn't figure this out, and they think it's something about them. But in reality, is the fact that there's many small things that they didn't know that then they sum up into, okay, I cannot get this done. And so usually you need to understand that everything in computer science, everything in programming is extremely simple. Every problem in isolation is simple. The reason why programming is hard is because you got to tackle all those things at once. They come at you all together. And so the best exercise is, again, to go to the atomic version of whatever you're doing. Break every function you're doing in a line of code. Break everything you're doing down to the while and for loop. And then you'll understand that all of these operations are extremely small, and then you conquer them independently, and then you can go and operate faster at a higher level because you know how all those pieces work independently.
And the third point is master the basics, right? And what do we mean by the basics? We mean the for and the while loops, the boring stuff, the simple stuff that maybe a React developer or someone that works within those abstractions in our daily job doesn't get a chance to touch.
I remember years ago when I went to my first live coding interview, back in the days I was working with React, and they told me to write a while loop. And I think I didn't know the signature of the while loop. Like, I didn't know how to write it. And the reason is simple. You don't write while loops in React. They're a disaster. They will destroy your app. They go out of control. In the same way, we never use recursion. And most of the times it doesn't make sense unless it's a very controlled environment. Like, the browser recurses the DOM. But for the most part, even NASA said it's forbidden to write recursion in any of the NASA code because it can go out of control. And so you go to that live coding interview, they ask you to write recursion, and they make you feel bad because you don't know it, and you interiorize that. But in reality, it's like, how are you supposed to know? It's not a good practice in the first place. The thing is, you want to get really good at the basic, and sounds very simple, right? Oh, get good at the basics. Everybody says that. But we are in an industry where every day I go on YouTube, I see a new library, see a new shiny object. And so it's so easy to get into the complex. It's like, oh, you need to talk about complex things. Oh, you need to know system design very well. But in reality, you'll get so much more, just like Jordan was saying, right? You get much more from the fundamentals. You get much more for knowing, again, go back to that exercise I mentioned, writing the for loop out of your top of your head, write a while loop, and then switch those to recursive. If you know how to do that, you're way ahead most people.
So once you master your fundamentals, we get to the second stage, which is pick your battles. Because even if you master the fundamentals, but then you try to, pick the wrong problems to solve, you're gonna get in trouble. And basically picking your battles mean don't go for dynamic programming if you are not going to interview at Google. And by the way, only about 3% of Google interviews contain dynamic programming problems.
Exactly. And we mentioned in the beginning that LeetCode, it's a bit of a disillusion and goes in line with this. A lot of people going and they try to solve graph problems or greedy algorithms or building a circuit breaker or dynamic programming. That's cool if you're really proficient at everything else. And you gotta remind yourself that 99% of companies will not interview like Google. And 99% of the companies will never ask you about dynamic programming. And that it's exponentially harder and it takes exponentially more time to get good at dynamic programming than to learn the fundamentals. And so pick the easy battle and get really good there. And then go out and interview and then come back and say, well, I'm going to ramp it up next level. I'm going to dominate the recursion. And then you go in and you're like, oh, let me get deeper into iteration and learn 2 pointers or sliding window. And only once you're fully confident of that, and full confidence means you can write that in a Word document. That's when I tell you, like, what does it mean I'm fully confident about this? I can write it in a Word document. Then you move on to graphs, greedy algorithms, dynamic programming, and the like.
And the final point is, of course, focus on patterns, not problems.
Exactly. So there is this huge bias towards specific problems. Everybody is running after the problems that Meta asks in their interviews or Stripe asks in their interviews. And people forgot that it doesn't matter how you solve a specific problem. There's this old saying that if you learn how to if you give someone a fish, they eat for a day. If they learn how to fish, they will never be hungry. And that's what you want to apply in your learning in general and specifically in live coding. So if I go in and I solve a problem that has literally no value for me, I would always ask myself, hey, what was the pattern I used? How did I broke this down? Or what is the pattern they use? And then I'll try to apply that to 2, 3, 5 problems until that's part of my mental tool set. And until that's like an engineering techniques I can use, find again solution to problems that match the same pattern.
And finally, this is just a bonus hint from Bogdan and I, but do get to know your keyboard. If you're a programmer, the best is if you can touch type.
And I think the average right now you are at around 100 VPNs. And I remember when you start getting good at this, that your girlfriend was getting jealous because you would spend more time with the keyboard than you would with her. And so that's the level of commitment you need, folks. You need to make at home your keyboard. Your keyboard, you should be more familiar with your keyboard than you are with the palm of your hand. Okay, you gotta love it. You gotta love being here. You gotta think magic things happen when I touch the keyboard, and you gotta make that your favorite place to be.
Yeah, if you're a musician or if you're good with your fingers, you probably have a head start. But in my case, I learned how to touch type pretty late in life. I wasn't, young anymore. Your brain is not so plastic, meaning, I had to wake up, Saturdays and Sundays, and I would practice every day for 15 minutes to 30 minutes on one of those, websites. Type every day, write in my journal, write as much code as I can. Right now, you have to understand, in those live coding interviews, there is so much pressure. You're in the red zone, and in the red zone, you want, you don't have time for mistakes, because every mistake will compound up to a point where you're paralyzed, which is why having this, making fundamentals your second nature, knowing how to touch type, right? Having practiced the simple problems and knowing how to abstract outside of all the abstractions, all these things are going to add up to a spectacular performance. I mean, you will impress yourself, you will stand out, and you will get the job if you do all these things. Keep up the good work. Bogdan, thank you so much. If you are looking to interview and if you're looking to understand what your technical gaps are and how to fix them, check out the free technical assessment that we have in the comments. And if you'd like Bogdan and I to personally mentor you, and you'd like to join a community of developers who are looking to level up, then also check out the software mastery program that we are offering. We have some spots left. Make sure you fill out your application, and if there's a fit, you can get in touch with me directly. With that being said, thank you so much, and we will see you in the next one.